Power, live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons.
Tonight, we're in a difficult situation. Those words today from Fed Chair Jay Powell as the Federal Reserve leaves interest rates unchanged. How the oil shock and the war with Iran complicate the Fed's forecast. And what Chairman Powell revealed about his future plans today amid an ongoing DOJ investigation. We'll talk it out with Joe Lavorgna, former counselor to Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, just moments from now.
And energy rising. Oil and gas prices surge as the world's largest plant for LNG comes under attack in Qatar, the latest in a string of strikes targeting energy facilities across the Gulf. We'll talk with Republican Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin about the economic cost of this war, as well as today's tense confirmation hearing for Markwayne Mullin to be DHS Secretary.
So let's begin with today's Fed decision, with the FOMC leaving rates unchanged and still forecasting one rate cut this year as policymakers acknowledge increased uncertainty due to war in the Middle East. Fed Chair Jay Powell emphasizing that in order to resume lowering rates, officials would have to see progress in reducing inflation, before saying this about the administration's investigation into him.
I have no intention of leaving the board until the investigation is well and truly over, with transparency and finality. And I would refer you to the statement that was in the Fed's brief that you will all have seen, and I won't have anything more for you on that. On the question of whether I will then continue to serve as a governor after my term ends and after the investigation is over, I have not made that decision yet, and I will make that decision based on what I think is best for the institution and for the people we serve.
Joining us now here in our Washington bureau is Bloomberg's Michael McKee, who was in the room, of course, for today's news conference. Mike, it's great to have you in Washington. I would love your take on what we heard from Chair Powell in terms of his own professional plans here as well. How long can the Fed look through the oil shock?
They can look through it for quite a while. The problem they have is they've got oil shock on top of tariffs. And basically what Powell was saying today during the news conference was we've had all these shocks in a row, and we can't be certain how it's all going to play out. So we're going to be on hold until we see some progress. And he did cite the PCE inflation numbers as where they need to see progress. And he thinks that tariff pressures will lessen and we'll see a drop in the overall inflation rate, except maybe in the headline because of oil. But he admitted there could be a problem that they still have to address, so they're leaving their options open. It was sort of a more humble admitting we don't really know, and so we're going to be very, very cautious.
Well, he literally said to take the SEP with a grain of salt, suggesting don't even bother looking
Yeah,
at
he
the
said
forecast.
we have to write down something, so we did. If this were a milk carton, it would expire tomorrow.
Well, Chairman Powell's term doesn't expire tomorrow. It is supposed to expire soon. And to the point we were making, not just on the question as to whether or not he's staying on as governor, he suggested if Warsh is not confirmed because of the investigation into him, I'm still going to be the guy for the time being.
Well, you guys are lucky because you get to cover politics, and this could be another big legal fight.
Can't wait.
The Federal Reserve Act says in the absence of the chair, the vice chair shall preside, and if both of them are absent, then the board will elect a chair pro tem. But it doesn't use the word vacancy. And if there's a vacancy, there's an old White House counsel's opinion that says that because of this dubious legal situation, in light of the limited authority of the vice chairman, we believe it is necessary for the president to designate one of the board members as acting chair. So it could be that the board and Jay Powell declare he's acting chair, and Donald Trump declares, no, I get to pick. And then what happens? That's going to be very, very interesting. Now, they can solve this whole problem by making the investigation going away and getting Kevin Warsh confirmed in time. But if he's not, it could be a rather interesting standoff.
Wow.
An interesting standoff in Washington. You don't say. We haven't seen any of those in the last year and a half. Bloomberg's Michael McKee, thank you so much, as always. And joining us now for more from World Headquarters in New York is Joe Lavorgna. He's chief economist at SMBC Americas. He also formerly served as counselor to Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. Joe, it's good to have you back outside of the Treasury Department here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Now that you're not joining us in an official government capacity, can you tell us if you think Chairman Powell and the Fed board made the right decision in not cutting rates today?
I thought you were going to ask me about whether the chair could stay as the pro temp role, which is interesting. Well, Michael McKee made a very interesting point, and this is up for debate. I don't think it's necessarily totally clear cut. I think the administration is probably aware of that. We'll see what happens. In terms of what the Fed did today, yes, they did what they were supposed to do, which is pretty much nothing because they're not sure what's going to happen with the outlook. Absent this oil and gas shock, I would be arguing for lower rates because the economy is in the middle of what could be a disinflationary supply side boom that's been engendered with pro-growth tax policies and deregulatory policies. But unfortunately, what's happening now with gas and oil does throw some serious risk in the outlook, and it will depend in large part on how long this lasts and how high do prices go and how long do they stay at whatever that high price turns out to be.
Hey, Joe, it's good to see you back in the wild. I'd love to go back to what Chair Powell said specifically about the conflict in Iran and the fog that it's brought to the crystal ball. Listen to Jay Powell from earlier.
The forecast is that we will be making progress on inflation. Not as much as we had hoped, but some progress on inflation. It should come as we start to see in the middle of the year progress on tariffs, going through once and then tariff inflation coming down. We should be seeing that. And, the rate forecast is conditional on the performance of the economy. So if we don't see that progress, then you won't see the rate cut.
So it's pretty stark the way he put it there. And there are questions about, of course, how long the conflict in Iran is going to last, never mind the sort of uncertainty about what types of tariffs the president might settle on following what could be a series, I realize, of investigations. If you were Jay Powell here and you had the cloud of Iran over your forecasting ability, what would you do when it came to interest rates?
Well, I would push back against the chair's comment on the tariffs. There may be a tariff effect in the data. It's certainly not that much. It's certainly not as much as many forecasters had said all along. And some other Fed governors have said, look, we should be looking through the tariffs and have been saying as much for a while. But leaving that aside, the problem, of course, is the Fed was way too easy for too long. And they freely admit that they made a huge mistake, or they basically have, back in 21 and, of course, hiking in 22 and inflation wasn't transitory. And that, to me, is sort of conditioning, I think, Jay Powell and many of the committee members' thought process, where they don't want to ease into a supply shock to mitigate the demand, especially if there is a quick resolution.
Well, it's interesting you say that, though, because we were hearing the word transitory today for the first time in years, Joe, because they are, quote unquote, looking through oil. Is there a parallel?
Well, there is. Well, I think the problem, though, is that if the oil price stays high for longer and you accommodate the oil shock, do you engender an unmooring or an increase in inflation expectation? Nobody exactly knows. The difference, though, between now and 22 is in 22, the labor market, because of the V-shaped recovery that began under President Trump and all the additional stimulus that took place under President Biden, labor market was generating significant job growth north of 300,000. Now, as you know, the labor market is showing much more weakness. It started decelerating sharply under President Biden. We've had significant downward revisions. Now you've got this oil situation. In some ways, you should be cutting rates because of the weakness of the labor market. But again, the Fed, having been burned before on inflation, wants to wait, and they're not sure how long this is going to last. So in that regard, I do think the chairman did a good job trying to balance these two conflicting concerns.
Well, so when we consider what's happening with oil prices, and obviously the president contends that when this conflict is over, whenever that is, he thinks prices are going to go even lower than they were before. But given the damage we are now seeing to energy infrastructure, what we're seeing, Joe, in the physical market, I wonder if that is also your assumption, is that energy prices will go back down, not just from the levels where they are now, but to below where we were before. And if that's not going to be the case, what the broader cascading effect of that will be.
Right now, I think it's very hard to get good information in terms of exactly how much damage has been done to the oil infrastructure. Clearly, if refining capacity in the Middle East has been taken offline, you're correct. It's going to take a while, at least for prices that people are paying, to reflect still what could be lower oil prices. Depends is how the situation resolves itself. Is there an oil premium built into the market? We just simply don't know these answers. I mean, you will see prices move down and down from where they are now, but to what level we don't know, because we're not sure what the exact end game looks like. What's the ultimate compromise or solution to what's happening. We don't know, and I think that reflects the tremendous uncertainty that the Fed is facing. I will tell you, absent, though, this oil shock, I came in and still am very bullish on underlying U.S. fundamentals, which are excellent. The productivity story, which to the Fed at least moved in the right direction, is very positive. The deregulation, the pro-growth tax policies, all these things are very additive to growth and will be additive over time to wages. So God willing, hopefully there'll be some resolution soon where Americans aren't going to suffer from these high oil prices, which can really throw a wrench into what I think would normally be a very good 26 outlook.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that because we hear so much about the resilience of this economy, Joe, and we're looking at $3.84 for the average, the national average today, and a number of states are higher, including Michigan, where Vice President J.D. Vance was speaking today. A lot of forecasts are pointing to $4 if this lasts much longer. Joe, how long can our economy withstand? How many weeks or months can we absorb prices like that? The
general rule I use is $1 increase in oil prices translates into 2.5 cents at the pump. So if oil goes up $40, you get roughly a $1 increase in the pump. For every 1 penny or $1 increase in oil prices, it effectively works out to what would be a $100 billion tax hike because consumers have to pay that cost in the short term. If we go another 3 or 4 weeks and there's some resolution, then we're not going to have much economic damage. But if we're sitting here a couple of months from now, and this is important, we start to see measures of consumer confidence break lower and you see measures of weekly consumer spending move down, that would be a sign the economy is weakening sharply. And if you're the Fed at that point, I think you're supposed to see through the inflation shock and cut rates because you don't want a recession. Because if you have a recession, you'll be back into a disinflationary environment, a significant disinflationary environment. So we have to watch the confidence in the consumer spending numbers and see if the economy is holding up. Another few weeks, we're okay. We go a few months from now, we're going to have some issues.
Well, and at what point, if it does get to a few months from now, would you be willing to use the stagflation language? I was struck, Joe, by the chairman essentially saying he only applies that in the 1970s type scenario, that he wouldn't even really be thinking about using it now. Would you?
Well, it's stagflation with a small s. It's not with a capital S. I mean, if we're growing at only 1%, argument's sake, and that's not my view, but if we're growing at 1%, and your CPI is running at 4%, a 3% gap, that's stagflation. It's not 1970s stagflation. And I think the president's policies as they relate to deregulation and increasing the supply side of the economy make it more resilient to a long-term inflation impulse. But it will be stagflation by investors' definition. Financial markets will suffer. You'll see a steeper yield curve with higher yields. You'll see lower equity prices because that's sort of the worst of both worlds. The Fed isn't cutting anymore. They're waiting, and the economy is not reaching its full potential.
Can the Fed cut as long as this war is underway?
They could cut. Well, if the looks like the economy is rolling over and the unemployment rate is gapping higher and moves up to 5%, then I think the Fed could cut and the Fed should cut. But if we're just in this environment with this holding pattern where nothing is really breaking, but things aren't great either, then they're going to sit and do nothing and wait. And the problem, of course, is if they wait too long and the underpinnings of what normally would be a fundamental economy soften, they're going to be too late. And there's an example of that happening back in '90 when the recession had begun. Alan Greenspan pushed against it. No, the economy wasn't weak, and they were too late in cutting, and they lost control of the labor market. Things softened quite significantly.
Boy, Joe Lavorgna back with us. It's great to have you, Joe. And we
Thank you.
Can keep the conversation rolling as Chief Economist, SMBC Americas. We thank you. Coming up, our conversation with Nadhim Zahawi, former UK Chancellor of the Exchequer, about the UK's stance on the ongoing conflict in the Middle East. Much ahead on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I'm not happy with the UK either. That island that you read about, the lease, okay, he made it for whatever reason, he made a lease of the island. Somebody came and took it away from him. And it's taken 3-4 days for us to work out where we can land there. It would have been much more convenient landing there as opposed to flying many extra hours. So we are very surprised. This is not Winston Churchill that we're dealing with.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons. And that was President Trump with some harsh words for UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer, criticizing his lack of support for the war with Iran. Earlier today, we spoke with Nadhim Zahawi, former UK Chancellor of the Exchequer, about that ongoing conflict, and started by asking him whether the UK did need to get more directly involved.
A couple of things. One, I think Keir Starmer made a mistake not to allow our bases, whether Fairford or Exchequer, to be used for the campaign. He changed his mind within 48 hours, and at least he did the right thing. But what he did do is then lose the confidence of a key ally, and I think that is problematic. The other problem we've got is we can't get a Navy vessel to protect our own sovereign base in Cyprus. You know, the French, the Spanish and the Greeks have got there before us. So we've got the one destroyer on its way there, and it's been 3 weeks and hasn't arrived. Now, that's partly, I have to say, put my hand up and say I was part of the last Conservative administration, and we didn't invest enough in our armed forces. The Navy's been hollowed out. So it's a difficult place to be for the United Kingdom. I do think that we should absolutely consider post the campaign, and it was interesting to see the president's tweet overnight, I think it was, because I think what you can't have is two different campaigns. If you're going to ask NATO to come and police the Straits of Hormuz, then the main campaign should have been completed, and then you have a coordinated effort by those countries. And I think that the president is right on this, that countries who are most impacted by oil price. I used to sit on the board of Gulf Keystone Petroleum, and I'm a chemical engineer by background. Clearly we've got to make sure the straits reopen. It's 1/5 of global supply that goes through there. And I think we should absolutely consider that. And I think, I hope we will be able to work within our sort of NATO formation to be able to do that. But you can't have two things happening at the same time. I mean, that's a recipe for mistakes to happen and things to go wrong.
Do you worry about repercussions here? The president referring to the UK as our once great ally. He was asked if there would be some punitive measure here yesterday. He didn't outline anything, but he's laid down the gauntlet for other nations to join this coalition, if we can call it that, by the end of the week.
Look, I think we all have a responsibility to think about what we can contribute to making sure that the Straits of Hormuz reopen.
Could this damage our relationship, though, as you work this out?
I worry, genuinely, that the United Kingdom, we are the closest ally to the United States of America. It's almost irrelevant. I lived in number 11 Downing Street. It's almost irrelevant who the occupant of number 10 Downing Street is or of the Oval Office. That relationship is so deep in terms of intelligence. We've got some of the best signals intelligence in the world in GCHQ. But sadly, successive governments, and this government has done no better, the British government, have really hollowed out the armed forces, and we need to rebuild that. And what I think we need to do is think about getting to 3.5% of GDP of investing in our defence. We need to make sure we step up, as do the rest of Europe and NATO. And I think that's where the president, people might disagree or find some of the language slightly difficult to deal with, but actually the overall point that he makes is NATO needs to step up. Rightly so. Countries who benefit from the oil price coming down need to step up. Countries who are exporting. And it's great to see, my old friend Anwar Gargash from the UAE talking about the UAE considering joining a coalition to keep the Straits of Hormuz open.
Well, so for the time being, the strait is not open, and we are seeing energy prices higher. Is there the ability in the UK for a fiscal response to that? Are we going to need to see help for households to deal with energy costs? I believe that cap, the next price cap, is expiring at the end of June. Do you foresee that needing to be extended?
The Chancellor's got no money at the moment. This is the great problem. She's had to U-turn on just slowing the acceleration of the rise of the fiscal problem.
So there's no room for
there is no money left because this government has failed to really sort of try and deal with things like welfare. They had to U-turn on the two-child cap, which is one of the big issues in the UK in terms of gaining welfare payments. So she's in real difficulty. We've deliberately self-harmed because we're spending something like 13 billion on net zero and making ourselves poorer. We've stopped exploring and producing our own oil from the North Sea. We have gas in the UK, both in the North Sea and shale gas, that we're not utilising, yet we are importing gas from Qatar all the way around to the United Kingdom. These are choices you make in politics, and I think the United Kingdom is making the wrong choices at the moment, sadly.
You know, it's interesting. It's been suggested that the increased price of oil, and more specifically LNG, is going to hit your economy before it does the United States.
Absolutely right.
To what extent? If this is weeks or maybe months long, what does your economy look like?
At the moment, it's got almost no growth. It's at about 1%, and you know how these things work. That's probably almost zero growth. We've got a tax burden as a percentage of GDP of 38.3%, highest, I think, since the war. So you can't use the tax lever. There's not much left to tax. We've got rid of most of the wealth creators because we changed the rules around domicile in the UK. They've ended up in Milan because Maloney's done a great job of attracting them with a flat tax there. She's raised it, by the way. She started at 100,000 euros per adult per year. It's now 200, then it went to 300,000 euros because it's successful. Or Dubai or Abu Dhabi and other places around the world. And so we're in a difficult place. Now imagine if you were still producing your own oil and your own gas. You'd be in a much healthier place. So we've ended up in a really a very difficult place for the UK. Now, it can be turned around, as we've seen with Italy, with what Maloney's been able to do. But we need, I think, a change of government, ultimately.
You can find our full conversation with Nadhim Zahawi, former UK Chancellor of the Exchequer, online or on the terminal. Coming up on Balance of Power, it was a busy day on Capitol Hill with dueling Senate hearings. And Kaylee, we're going to get into that coming up here because it was a question of which part of the split screen to watch today. There you see it on Bloomberg TV. Markwayne Mullin in one hearing, Tulsi Gabbard in another. Markwayne Mullin facing some pretty difficult questioning here when it comes to his potential future as the next head of the Department of Homeland Security. Remembering he called the chairman a snake?
Well, and the chairman remembered that. In fact, that's how this began, with Senator Rand Paul basically asking for an apology.
That's
and Markwayne Mullin saying, I am not willing to give one, standing by what he said. That said, Rand Paul, while he's going to be a no vote on his nomination, does expect every other Republican will be voting to confirm him. The question we have, though, is if that vote is still going to happen, because there's also questions around what exactly Senator Mullin did in the Middle East years ago, something that they needed to discuss in a skiff.
This is a fascinating part of the story that you might have missed if you were at work today. We're going to unpack this coming up here. They did bring the senator into the skiff to talk about apparently a classified assignment that brought him overseas and allowed him to smell war, as he said. Kaylee, we have no idea what that means, but it could jeopardize the timing of a vote tomorrow. We'll get into all of this and spend some time with Republican Senator Ron Johnson, a member of the Homeland Security Committee, straight ahead on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
The This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons. The war with Iran is escalating 19 days in, with the regime now threatening energy infrastructure in other Gulf states in retaliation for an Israeli strike on its South Pars gas field. In a statement via Iran's Tasnim news agency, authorities warned facilities in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar would be targeted. And indeed, the complex in Qatar that houses the world's largest LNG export plant has suffered extensive damage after a missile strike today. Joining us now is Becca, defense lead for Bloomberg Economics. And when it comes to energy, obviously, we've all been so laser focused on the Strait of Hormuz specifically and energy's ability to get out of the Middle East. Now we're having an infrastructure question of just getting the energy out of the ground, or the LNG, the oil out of the ground in the first place.
Absolutely. And I think what we have already seen is Iran has been able to do a lot with very little. They've used the missiles and the drones that they have to increasingly go after some of that critical energy infrastructure. We've seen that across the Gulf. And now it's that plus being able to hold the Strait of Hormuz at risk. And that is driving a high geopolitical price on oil prices right now.
Well, and so when we consider the strikes that Iran may have yet to pursue in addition to what we saw today, this is just becoming an incredible kind of collage, if you will, Becca, of the number of targets we have seen hit, not just inside of Iran, but in the entire region as a whole.
Absolutely. When we've looked at this map showing all of the strikes across the region in the previous weeks, it didn't look nearly as dense. Now we are seeing a lot more strikes, both U.S. and Israeli strikes in different parts of Iran, as well as increasing attacks all across the Gulf and Israel, as well as through Iraq, Syria, and Turkey from Iran. So it's definitely getting quite sporty out there if you're looking at how many launches and strikes you've seen.
Well, and obviously, and we've known from past experience about Israel's kind of defensive capabilities and intercepting things Iran sent its way. What about the other Gulf states that have had to do this at really incredible rates that we haven't necessarily seen before?
Absolutely. They've very much learned as they've been doing it. They, have shifted from trying to take some of these mixed salvos of drones and missiles and use more expensive air defense interceptors. Now they're trying to use other more affordable ways of doing so. But we've seen that the drone and missile attacks from Iran have held relatively steady. Folks have kind of asked the question, are they going to run out of missiles? And my answer thus far is probably not anytime soon. They've been able to hold all of these countries with various attacks, and you've seen that they've even had an uptick in attacks, looking at how yesterday there was over 90 drones flown at Saudi Arabia alone. That's a pretty big jump from what they used to have and what they continue to do.
It's incredible stuff. Becca Wasser, thank you so much. Defense lead for Bloomberg Economics. Joe.
Joining us now for more live from Capitol Hill is Republican Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin, who serves on the Budget, Finance, and Homeland Security committees, which means we always have a lot to talk about. Senator, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. It's good to have you here, and I'd like to start with the matter of Iran before we go on to some other issues here. As what I would consider the most famous budget cutter in the United States Senate. I'm sure you're watching the numbers here. Outflows so far of what we understand approaching $15 billion. The last check was $11.2 billion for the first 6 days. $3 million missiles to shoot down $1,000 drones, as we keep hearing the cost of operations, the impact that it's having on the energy market. Are you getting the yips yet? Is this keeping you up at night?
Well, listen, I hate to see the death. I hate to see the destruction. I hate to see the asymmetric cost of this thing. There's no doubt about it. But the sad fact of the matter is Iran has been at war with us for 47 years. They're the largest state sponsor of terror. They are a menace. They're holding the Strait of Hormuz hostage, whether they're actually closing it or not. This regime cannot end soon enough.
Well, it does appear, and Tulsi Gabbard, the director of national intelligence, said today that the regime is intact, even if obviously a lot of Iran's capability has been depleted. And I guess the question is going to be for how long we're going to go after that capability and how big this price tag gets. To Joe's point, Senator, there's been a lot of buzz about a potential supplemental funding request coming from the White House or from the Pentagon. Has the Budget Committee seen any firm numbers yet? Does $50 billion sound like it might be the ballpark?
We haven't seen any numbers. That's the number people have been talking about. From my standpoint, we went from $4.4 trillion of spending in 2019 to $7.4 I've laid it out. I mean, we're spending hundreds of billions of dollars, way in excess of what we spent in 2019, plus up for inflation and population. So if we get that supplemental, I will certainly make an attempt to offset it in areas of spending where we shouldn't. Now, how about the fraud? As we're starting to see just the jaw-dropping levels of fraud in Minnesota, now California, I'm sure that's repeated in almost every state of the union. We ought to focus on that. But in the end, spending on national defense is a top priority of government. It's something I'll have to support.
Senator, I want to ask you about the hearing that we saw today. The Senate Homeland Security Committee with Senator Markwayne Mullin, your colleague from Oklahoma, of course, tapped by President Trump to lead DHS in the wake of Kristi Noem's departure. There was a lot of discussion around the senator's activities in 2015, a classified trip overseas, and I realize that resolved in the skiff. I believe you were part of that conversation because he couldn't speak about it openly. There was a question about whether this would jeopardize the timing of a vote tomorrow. Can you tell us if you expect a vote to confirm Senator Markwayne Mullin tomorrow?
Well, again, I'm not the one making that decision. I certainly hope there is a vote. You know, for my part, listen, you can focus in on a particular instant, a particular something somebody said that maybe they regret. But what I try to point out is you'd have to look at the entire life of somebody. And I think Markwayne Mullin in that hearing laid out the kind of human being he is. I mean, the kind of relationships he's developed here in Washington, D.C., which is not the easiest thing to do across the aisle. And for my part, I just let him tell a couple stories that showed the kinds of relationships that will be important to him as Secretary of Homeland Security. So I hope we hold that vote. I'm certainly going to support him. I think Republicans will. Hopefully some Democrats will as well.
Understood. I don't mean to interrupt you, but the chairman's not confirmed a vote for tomorrow then, just to be clear.
Not as far as I know, he might have, but I just don't have that knowledge. Sorry.
Sure.
Well, Senator, you were speaking to the type of human being that Senator Mullin is. He certainly is a different human being entirely from Kristi Noem, who he would be succeeding. Do you expect there to be real daylight in terms of the policy, what is pursued by the Department of Homeland Security under a Secretary Mullin compared to a Secretary Noem?
Well, you've already seen the shift as Tom Homan was really put back in charge of exactly how we handle the apprehensions and detentions. And my guess is Senator Mullin would send down that same path. But in the end, they all work for President Trump, and he's the boss.
Where are we on funding then for DHS, Senator? You know, there was a thought that a new face at the top might get the conversation going again here and maybe create a path to fund DHS. As people start lining up at airports, TSA workers without pay, a lot of them are calling in sick because they have to drive Uber or do whatever to make money, is really raising a lot of questions about how long this can go on for. Can Markwayne Mullin make the difference to get DHS open once he's confirmed?
I mean, I hope so, but again, this is unconscionable what the Democrats are doing. With the heightened threat levels that we have because of what's happening in Iran, I mean, the fact that we're not funding so many parts of our homeland security that are crucial to our national security it's literally unbelievable. And quite honestly, the only reason it's gotten to this point is most of the legacy media, the corporate media, they don't hold Democrats accountable. If the tables were turned and this were Republicans holding up DHS funding, it would be scorched earth in the media. We would have caved weeks ago, but there's virtually no pressure on Democrats whatsoever.
Well, when we consider then Democrats' position here, knowing that there's been a back and forth with the White House, there is no further area for compromise in your mind beyond what has been outlined.
Well, they may have been going back and forth a little bit, but last week we were told that Democrats weren't meeting. They weren't meeting with Katie Britt, the chair of our Appropriations Subcommittee. They weren't meeting with Senate leadership. Hadn't really been meeting with the White House. It was just pretty much radio silence. Maybe there's been some exchanges. I know the White House has offered things. Pretty reasonable from my standpoint. I don't think they really had to offer much at all, but they have. Again, they're trying to get the department funded. It needs to be funded. The fact that 260,000 employees, literally, they're not getting paychecks. They won't be able to feed their families. We should have passed the Shutdown Fairness Act. They would be getting paid, but Democrats blocked that as well.
I want to ask you about the Save America Act, Senator. There's hours, days of debate taking place in the Senate this week. Is this the right approach right now? Is this a way to unglue Democratic votes, or will this fail when it comes to a vote on the floor?
So I've been here 15 years. I think this is our first chance to actually work on a piece of legislation the way it's supposed to be worked on. In other words, put forward a piece of legislation. It's not complete. Allow an amendment process to hopefully improve it. And of course, one of the improvements that could be made is, expand the people who will actually support it. So I was on the floor when Senator Schumer was saying that, Democrats, they are for common sense voter ID. Okay, well, what do you mean by that? If it's common sense, if it's voter ID, maybe we can accept it. So let's use the amendment process. Let's improve this piece of legislation. Hopefully, let's get votes for it so it can pass, because 80% of Americans want the type of measures that we're talking about here so that their legitimate vote is not canceled out by a fraudulent vote.
Well, I guess it then becomes a question of the number of votes needed to pass, as there's been plenty of talk, as you know, Senator, some of it has come from you, about killing the filibuster in the name of passing the Save America Act. Would that be dangerous to do just ahead of the midterms where control of the Senate is in question?
Well, what I propose now is let's just take a vote on a rule change at 67 votes, because the splitting of the Republican Party is, we all want the filibuster to be able to stop bad Democrat legislation. But Democrats have made their position quite clear. The only two senators that voted against any of the filibuster when they had the power have been purged from their party. So the split in our conference is, do you believe Democrats will end the filibuster when they have the chance, or are you hoping against hope that they won't? So let's get them on the record. Let's vote for a rule change and see if Democrats will vote to end the filibuster like they did when they were in power, when Republicans are in power. It's the only way I can think of dissuading them from not ending the filibuster once they get in power.
All right, Senator, we appreciate you joining us live from Capitol Hill. Republican Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin. Thank you. Coming up, we'll continue our discussion on today's contentious Senate hearings, not just with Markwayne Mullin, but with Tulsi Gabbard as well, when we bring in our political panel next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons. Tonight, U.S. officials say the president wants no more strikes on Iranian energy sites following Israel's attack on a crucial Iranian gas field. This according to a report from the Wall Street Journal. Officials saying the president believes Iran got the message and is now against further attacks on their energy infrastructure. For the latest, we turn now to Jeff Mason, who is joining us live from the White House North Lawn. Jeff, is this a president that is now fearful that this has escalated a bit too far?
Well, I don't know if it's fair to say that it's escalated for him, that it's escalated too far, but it is certainly a president who is worried about energy and worried about energy prices and worried about how the price of oil is having an impact on American consumers. And you've heard me say a million times on Bloomberg Air, the political risks for him are high going into the midterm elections in November if these gasoline prices stay at elevated levels. So not wanting to disrupt or destroy Iranian energy infrastructure is not necessarily his way of saying he doesn't want to still continue the war, but it sounds like it is his way of saying we don't want to focus on that.
Jeff, we were reminded today of the human cost of this conflict with 6 Americans who lost their lives last week in a tanker crash over Iraq, western Iraq. Arriving back home today, the president went to Dover to meet them. What can you tell us about that?
He did indeed go to Dover, Joe, and what I can tell you is I've covered some of these what are called dignified transfers before. It's very sobering. It's very, very sad. Family members are there, and they are there to honor the war dead coming back to the United States. I will also add to that it's usually the family that gets to decide whether reporters get to watch. In this case, reporters did not get to watch today. But to go back to the politics, which is a hard thing to do on something as sobering as this, it's also not a good picture for President Trump if he has to continue going to Dover to welcome back fallen American soldiers in a war that he chose to launch after promising as a presidential candidate that he would not start new wars. So going back to that topic of political risk, that's a political risk for him as well.
Well, that's something you know a lot about, Jeff, and we appreciate your being with us. Bloomberg's Jeff Mason live from the White House this evening. We thank you, as always, with now a total of 13 Americans dead in this conflict. Let's assemble our political panel. Jim Kessler is back with us today, Democratic strategist and executive vice president for policy at Third Way, alongside Republican strategist Sarah Chamberlain, president and CEO of the Republican Main Street Partnership. It's great to have both of you here, and I'd like to get back to a pretty wild day today on Capitol Hill. The hearing for Senator Markwayne Mullin was pretty tense, considering the fact that pretty much everyone agrees that he's going to be confirmed. Having referred to the chairman, Rand Paul, as a snake at one point, I guess he had to answer to some of this commentary. Pretty unusual to see the D and the R, the chair and ranking member, both going after the witness.
I know. I've not seen that, I think, yet. But it's personal. I mean, they've never liked each other. They continue not to like each other. And it just was evident today.
It's not personal for Gary Peters, of course, as the Democrat.
Right. The Democrats, it's their job.
Did we learn anything about what the senators refer to as his anger management?
I don't think he has anger management issues. I mean, he's a member of the Republican Main Street Partnership. He gets intense. The gentleman that he offered, if you remember, when he stood up and was, that's
Sean
now
O'Brien,
right. They're still now very good friends.
He was sitting right behind him.
He brought a human prop to the confirmation hearing.
I mean, so yes, he gets fired up, but ultimately they're good friends. I mean, I've never seen him do anything offensively. He's a great guy, great senator, and I think he'll be wonderful at Department of Homeland Security.
Well, we just asked Senator Ron Johnson, who's a member of that committee, was present for the testimony today, obviously, what difference a Secretary Mullin will be relative to a Secretary Noem. He said, I think you've already kind of seen the changes with Tom Homan, expect more of that, but ultimately they're still going to answer to President Trump. Will he bring real change, do you think, Jim?
Well, they need to bring real change. And look, this is an issue where Donald Trump was way ahead of Democrats. Immigration, the border. Now he's behind Democrats on some of these issues, particularly interior enforcement. So when your biggest strength becomes now a weakness, it shows that there's real problems there. So I'm hoping there's going to be a change. I do think replacing Kristi Noem was the right thing to do. Tom Homan was definitely a step up. We'll see if Senator Mullin is as well.
We mentioned briefly with Senator Ron Johnson the fact that this hearing also resolved in a meeting in a skiff. Over a classified trip that Markwayne Mullin took in 2015, although I heard references to multiple trips. Nobody seems to know, other than Markwayne Mullin, exactly what he was up to, whether this was military, Sarah, CIA. This is back when he was a congressman. I think he was probably a member at that point. Do you have any idea what he was doing?
I do not, though I will tell you both Paul Ryan was Speaker. He's confirmed it, and Kevin has also confirmed it. So he is telling the truth. There's a lot of things that goes on in this country that not all Americans know.
Well,
My late husband was in that world, so
really?
Yes. So, we're not meant to know everything, but they confirmed it, so I believe them.
I wish someone would have asked the CIA director, Ratcliffe, about this in his hearing.
Next door. How about that?
Because that was, of course, happening at the same time. It wasn't just the CIA director, FBI director, Kash Patel, as well as the director of national intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, who actually, in her written prepared remarks, said that Operation Midnight Hammer did obliterate Iran's nuclear capacity. And she planned to say in those remarks, since then there has been no effort to rebuild their enrichment capacity. But she didn't actually say that out loud when the time came. Listen to this exchange as it was noted by Senator Mark Warner.
You omitted that paragraph from your oral opening. Was that because the president had said there was an imminent threat 2 weeks?
No, sir. I recognize that the time was running long, and I skipped through some of the portions.
So you chose to take
my oral delivered remarks.
You chose to omit the parts that contradict the president.
What do you make of that, Jim?
Well, it shows the dance that we're playing here, particularly on the Republican side, and the real split in the MAGA wing about this Iran war, which
Gabbard used to sell no war with Iran shirts.
Yeah.
Right, and I think that 98% of the people who voted for Donald Trump did not expect that we'd be at war with Iran within 14 or 15 months. I think the other thing it shows, both this and the Mullin hearing, is Republicans are starting to be more willing to break with Donald Trump. Okay, they're showing a little bit of character. Rand Paul did it. We saw Tom Tillis do it a few weeks back with Kristi Noem. I don't know what this means with Tulsi Gabbard, but she put it in her testimony. And that's the official record there. So it means something.
Really interesting. Although, I mean, if you're a cabinet official in the wake of Kristi Noem, and you're called to Capitol Hill for a hearing, you know it's the audience of one, right, Sarah?
Absolutely. Which, I mean, he's not going to read the testimony. He's going to watch it on TV. And she delivered for him. It's her job. She is a Democrat, but she took this job. We all know she was opposed to the war in Iran, but she serves for the president.
So we assume she passed the test. And there was a time when she was on the short list for next one out the door. Remember,
there was, but there's a couple others that have surpassed her on that list. So, right.
I guess we're going to have to wait and see if that indeed becomes her fate. Out as Joe Kent, her counterterrorism chief until yesterday, obviously resigned in protest over the war. I want to switch gears a little bit because while we're having this conversation about geopolitics, there's also a lot happening in domestic politics. There was a primary last night in Illinois in which, and I guess this is actually tangentially related as it comes to Israel, AIPAC spent some $21 million. Got a 50% success rate, 2 for 4 candidates at least in the House. But what were your takeaways from Illinois' primary?
So I think that is charitable scoring for AIPAC.
Okay.
I don't think it was a great night for AIPAC. I think it was a great night for J Street, which
more
is
about J Street in the last 48 hours.
Which is the more progressive Jewish pro-Israel organization. But a couple of things that we learned from the primaries. One is mainstream still beats extreme in Democratic primaries. And so mostly mainstream candidates won. And having a absolutist position on Israel in either direction is not going to work in the Democratic primary.
What does it say about J.B. Pritzker in 2028? He had a big night.
Yeah, and a lot has been made about it shows his power.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think that should be unexpected that the governor of the state, who's also got $1 billion, is able to really have a huge effect in a Democratic primary. I think maybe he's getting a little bit more juice out of this than he deserves, but
should we be having 2028 conversations right now? J.D. Vance is in Michigan. That's all anyone's talking about. The state, of course, plays into that. J.B. Pritzker, maybe it's never too soon, Sarah.
It's never too soon.
All right.
I mean, right after the November elections, we'll be in 2028.
Fair enough.
So here we go.
It's begun already.
Well, something else that stood out to me about Illinois in particular is it pertains not just to 2028, but 2026. We're talking about the Israel-oriented PAC money, but AI and crypto, we're getting pretty active in this as well. And I wonder for your members also who are seeking re-election, how they're thinking about the tech factor money now and going forward.
Well, the tech factor has been very important, and we appreciate all of their support that they've given to our members.
Very diplomatic of you.
But really, what we did watch out of last night was the huge turnout for the Democrats. That's a little bit nerve-wracking as a Republican. Obviously, the Democrats are fired up to vote. I mean, it's one of the biggest in history in a non-presidential year. So we're watching that closely. And the other thing we're watching on that is your organization and my organization has also always said the more people turn out, the more middle-of-the-road candidates in both parties get elected. And we really need that in this country.
Well, we've only got 30 seconds left. After the turnout we saw by Democrats in Texas, for instance, what does that tell you about the rest of the cycle?
Well, this is going to be a bad cycle for Republicans. And I think some states and districts that normally would be off the map are going to be on the map. Texas, that's still a big reach, but I think it's in the realm of possibilities, still a big reach.
Yeah, and the Hispanic vote obviously could be crucial in the way that swings. We'll have to get into that another time with our stellar political panel today. Jim Kessler, Sarah Chamberlain, thank you both so much. And, of course, for more coverage, check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
You'll have, as usual, much to catch up on. And we thank you for joining us on Balance of Power. See you back here tomorrow alongside Kaylee Lines. I'm Joe Matthew. This is Bloomberg.